Welcome to today's seminar. So first, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet today. I pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country, and we recognize their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. So I'm Rennie Lee, and I'm one of the co-coordinators of the LCC seminar series. You've probably seen me or Nancy's name floating around. So today we will be hosting our seminar for November with Professor Richard Layte. But I wanted to just give you a brief, just to also let you know that part of today's seminar is part of the LCC's activities for Anti-Poverty Week in 2022. So even though the actual Anti-Poverty Week was last week, we're kind of focusing on using the whole month of October to bring awareness to Anti-Poverty Week. So the LCC, if you don't know, is a major sponsor of Anti-Poverty Week. And this year marks the 20th anniversary of Australia kind of dedicating a week to act on poverty. And this year's Anti-Poverty Week is calling on Australia to legislate a plan to end child poverty have child poverty by 2030 to meet our commitments to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. If you're interested, you can find out more information about this call to action at antipovertyweek.org.au. Today, our speaker is Professor Richard Layte. He's visiting us from the Department of Sociology at Trinity College in Dublin. And much of his work stems from a core interest in the structure of social and economic stratification in modern societies and its impact on individual life chances, health, and well-being. His research examines the fundamental processes that influence the distribution of health and well-being in societies and how these are shaped by political economy, the structure and functioning of healthcare systems. He has a particular interest in improving and understanding how family background influences child health and development and the impact of this on child's educational outcomes, adult health, and life expectancy. Some of Professor Layte's recent work has examined whether the Great Recession in Ireland had an effect on child health and development, the pathways and mechanisms through which these effects occurred, and implications for this on Lifecourse models of health and well-being. And finally, he has a keen interest in the intersection of social, psychological, and biological science and works with colleagues across a range. So without further ado, I will let Richard proceed with this talk. Thanks so much again for joining us.
Ready. Thank you very much indeed. So yes, I would just like to say thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak today, and delighted to get a chance to talk to you all and hopefully answer some of your questions on the work that I've been doing. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet today and pay my respects to their ancestors and their descendants before I begin, okay? So let's get underway. I'm hoping to only speak for about 35 minutes, right? So we should be finished by 12:40. And what I want to do is I want to talk to you, really, it's a sort of a broad presentation about my work. Well, it's a broad presentation on a sort of a central thread that connects together a lot of the work that I've done, because my background is as a sociologist. For my sins, I'm a sociologist by origin, and my work originally was looking at the liberal theory of industrialization and the impact of the liberal theory, some of the predictions of the liberal theory of industrialization for social mobility within industrialized nations. And I was particularly looking at Ireland and the UK. But subsequently, after looking at how social mobility and the association between, that is, parental household and child outcomes in terms of their education and their occupational attainment. After doing that, I started working on health and the consequences of social position for health outcomes, and particularly health inequalities. And it struck me that there were real similarities between these two areas of study. And indeed, although they were often seen as being separate domains, actually they were two questions that were intimately linked. And that's what I want to try to bring out for you today. And as Rennie said, my work kind of, I'm afraid, crosses lots of boundaries. So although I'm a sociologist, I've done lots of work in psychology and in medical science. So I'm going to try to bring those all together, okay, using my central concept of embodiment. So here are my two connected questions. So the first one is, how does social position get under the skin and lead to health inequalities? All right. How does that happen? And the second question is, how does family environment shape educational and occupational attainment? Now, these are usually treated as completely separate questions, right? People often, for the first question, what they do is they start with sort of pristine individuals, usually in adulthood. And when I say pristine, what I mean is they have good health, all right? And then they look at how social environment and economic environment, the resources and the individuals and families have, and the kinds of environments they live in, and how that then leads to differential pathways in terms of their health, leading to health inequalities and to differentials in life expectancy, okay? And they usually start that from adulthood. But in fact, that process starts much earlier. In fact, we know that those differentiations in structure and function, in individual health, well-being, also the physiology of the individual, starts much earlier. In fact, we could be seen as starting prenatally, and I'm going to give you some evidence about that in a moment. And of course, though that developmental trajectory of differences in health and well-being, that has influences, I'm going to show you, on the educational and occupational attainment of individuals as well, right? So these two domains are really quite connected. And it's in many respects the dual acquisition of human capital, okay? And we can think here of human capital in a very broad way as both the physiological, the social, the economic, and the psychological. It's that differential trajectories of human capital acquisition and the kind of social and emotional traits that individuals develop over time, which influences both the educational and occupational attainment, but also health inequalities, all right? So that I'm going to be addressing both those questions. And I'm going to do that by building you, first of all, a sort of a theoretical structure that you can use to think about these issues. And it's all connected with the Lifecourse model of health, okay? Which I know is very relevant to your center that you work in at LCC. So I'm going to build you a theory, but before I do that, I'm going to show you now about 6 slides, and it's essentially the same slide repeated again and again, okay? You might get a bit bored, but I just want to show you the social gradients in both health and in terms of education attainment and in terms of psychological development. I want to show you how these things are connected. So I'm going to show you the same slide 6 times, right? But I'm going to draw out what connects them. So here we've got Irish mortality rates in 2016, okay? And you can see here, what I want to bring out here is the fine-grained gradient that there is between social class position within Ireland, both for men and for women, and overall, okay? And the way that it's a gradient rather than a step function. Sometimes we think of health differences, differentials and inequalities being between the poor and everybody else, but it's not, is it? You can see here, professional and non-manual workers have the best or the lowest levels of mortality in terms of mortality rates, and those in more manual occupations, particularly the less skilled manual occupations, having the highest mortality rates. So there's a fine-grained gradient, not a step function. Here's the same thing, okay, but now we're looking at area deprivation instead of individual census returns and their linkage to mortality records. Here, what we're looking at is that for individuals differentiated in terms of the deprivation, social deprivation in the area, again, you see the same thing. You see that gradient, don't you, between the least deprived having the highest life expectancy and the most deprived having the lowest life expectancy, and that's true for both men and women. You can see in this slide the way that starts from very early life. This is the social patterning of low birth weight in Ireland. So this is the proportion who are under 2,500 grams or less, which we define as low birth weight. You can see there's a gradient here in this, and that goes on in through childhood, so that by the time they get to age 17, 18, I'm And I'm using data here from our longitudinal study of children called Growing Up in Ireland. And what I'm showing you here are social differentiations, social gradients really, in heart rate by social class position of parents, all right? And this is at 17 or 18. And you can see here that those young people coming from more manual and less skilled households, they have higher heart rates. And we see the same thing for blood pressures as well, right? So we've got really well-measured physiological markers of differential cardiovascular function at a really young age. This is 17, 18, and they're already bearing the marks, if you like, of their environments that they've been experiencing since birth. But it's not just in terms of their health. We also see differentiations across these social groups in terms of the educational achievement and the educational development of these children. So here we're looking at educational test scores age 9. This is the first time we met this cohort. This is cohort 98. I'm not going to tell you too much about Growing Up in Ireland, but just to tell you, this is 8,500 children. First measured at 9, we saw them again at 13, 17, 18, and then we saw them at 20, and we're going to see them again at 25. But you can see here that there's a gradient in educational test scores on both reading and maths. This is using the Drumcondra test scores, which are sort of an Irish measure. So it's not just in terms of health. You can see that there's the fine-grained gradients here in educational outcomes, which then leads to differentiations in their achievements over time. So at age 15, these are test scores, or rather, these are exam scores, exam points, as I'm calling them, on their junior certificate exams, which are age 15. These are the sort of exams they take before they go on into the senior cycle to take their terminal exams at 18. And you can see there's quite good social class differentiations at 15, and they go on to their leaving cert exams at 18. So you can see here that we've got the same gradients by social class, and these are the exams that they will take that allow young people to get entry into third level if they wish to. But look at the social differentiation. So if a young person is getting about 300 plus points, all right, so that's the sort of the yellow, blue, and green component. 300 plus points will get you into third level. All right? And you can see that that's true of about 90% of those in the professional and higher managerial group. But actually, you're down to about a third of those in the unskilled manual group. You get above 400 points and you'll be able to get onto a university course. And above 500 points, you might get onto a prestigious university course or program. Okay, that's things like law and medicine and the higher social, more elite institutions in the Irish context. But look at the social differentiations there. So in terms of 500 plus points, that is going to be much more likely amongst those coming from the professional managerial. And the 400 plus, you can see, is the 2/3 or more of the most advantage. So, all right, we've got here clear differentiations by health and well-being, but also in terms of educational development. That's probably going to lead on to occupational differentiations, because education is one of the biggest predictors of occupational outcomes. And this slide, he said, try to click, it shows you one of the factors that might be implicated in that differential education attainment, and that's the psychological adjustment of the child. Notice here that on all our measures of psychological adjustment, this is using SDQ, the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire, you get gradients across our young people. This is at age 9. These go on at 13 and 17 as well, these gradients. And we see the similar differentiations across other measures of psychological development that we have, like internalizing and externalizing conditions. And what this marks out to me is the intimate connection between these different domains that we see for young people. We have to see them as being not only interconnected, but in a sense, also mutually supporting, in the sense that the social environment and the physical environment is influencing both the physical development, the physiological development of the child, but also their cognitive development and their psychological development, their emotional development, and their social skills. So these things are all socially, or they're being mutually supportive, all right? We're seeing that the very biological structure of the young person is being influenced by their social and physical environment. But we're also seeing that social environment is shaping their psychological nature, their emotions, their temperament, and their cognitive ability. And all these things are also being influenced by and influencing the social and cultural behaviors of the young person. They're being socialized in particular ways. They're gaining certain kinds of social cognitions, as we would call them. These are their recognition of things like social status, their recognition about social norms and expectations that people have of them. All these things are intimately connected, mutually supportive in some ways, but of course you could see them as leading to sort of clustered disadvantage as well, where disadvantage on one dimension, say psychological development, leads to poorer outcomes on another social dimension as well. That there could be a vicious circle as well as virtuous circles. All right. Now we have theories that allow us to try to understand them, this kind of interplay of different factors. We have them for both public health and social epidemiology. And on the left-hand side here, you can see the Dahlgren and Whitehead framework that's often used in studies of social inequalities in health. And here, what you can see that you have the sort of macro environment, the socioeconomic, cultural, and environmental conditions of individuals influencing their kind of meso environment, the kind of social and community networks that they have, and their family environment that then influences their physical health and well-being at the very bodily level. Okay, so you can see here that we have a sort of framework that helps us to understand this, just as the Bronfenbrenner's socio-ecological model also gives us a way of understanding the way that the child's health and development is influenced by the macro system and the meso system of within which they live, and that there are interactions between these things. But I want to point to the fact that in both these frameworks, we don't see, in a sense, the kind of important role that time and development plays here. Time and change. Sometimes in the Bronfenbrenner system, we see the chronosystem brought in, which is supposedly about change and development and time. But actually, it doesn't really have give us a structured understanding about how these processes might work. And that's what I just want to speak about now for a couple of moments. Okay, so for example, we need to think about the way that earlier experiences in the life course then structure not only later experiences, okay, but they, to a certain extent, determine the possibility of certain options. That is, that earlier experiences may lead to path dependencies that make some occurrences more likely to occur later in the life course and other occurrences less likely to occur. And I want to use here Waddington's epigenetic landscape to try to explain this. This is from Conrad Waddington, okay, who was initially at Cambridge and then later at Edinburgh. And he put forward, at a time when actually understanding of epigenetics was quite low, he was putting forward a sort of Lamarckian view or Lamarckian theory of genetic change, which tried to explain how the environment might influence the biological expression of certain traits and characteristics. And he put forward this idea of the epigenetic landscape, and that is that earlier on in development, there's a large number of possibilities, but the environment starts to, the word is canalization. It starts to canalize the individual's trajectory. And you can see in the little pictures here about the way that if the environment pushes the ball bearing off to one direction, it sends it down a channel that means that it's increasingly difficult to move down the other channel. And you're seeing increasing canalization of the individual. Their very physiological development is being canalized here. And I want to use this concept of canalization to show how we inject path dependency into individual trajectories across the life course. So we have to think about different kinds of canalization. We've got both the biological canalization that happens with development. All right, so here we can think of adaptive or maladaptive development physiologically and psychologically, because of course psychological can refer to the sort of physiological development of structure and function in the brain that leads to differential outcomes. And this is amplifying differences across time. We also have social or societal or social structural canalization, where, the individual is being selected by social structures or institutional structures to create certain kinds of trajectories. And these create inequalities across time and across the life course, right, that the individuals have to both react to, but nonetheless are being structured by. They're being sort of selected down certain pathways, which, when sent off in certain directions, make it much more unlikely that they're going to be able to get back to other channels. And then it becomes increasingly expensive or difficult to make those transitions. But where, you might ask, is the kind of agency in all this? How are individual agency expressed here? Well, we have to think of individuals as being motivational agents through these processes, right? They're intentional agents. They have goals that they're pursuing. They have certain expectations. And of course, these are all very socialized. Their values are socialized. Their norms are socialized, creating certain kind of expectations. So we have this agency alongside different types of channelization, leading to my concept of embodiment, okay? This was part of a project that I worked on a few years ago with colleagues from different European countries and North America, actually, called Lifecourse. So there were lots of different teams involved. And Lifecourse was looking at embodiment, the way that the social environment shaped the various cells, organs, of biological systems of individuals. It is embodied in the individual. But I want to generalize that out, as I have been, and as a social scientist within this group, I was always trying to show that actually the social environment also influenced the way that other dimensions of the individual, like their psychological traits, but also their social cognitions worked, the kind of very beliefs they had about their environments, again, shaping the life course. And then to sort of think about this in a better way, I think it's good to bring in this man, Pierre Bourdieu. If you're a social scientist, you've probably come across Bourdieu. He wrote this book in the 1960s. It wasn't really published in English until the 1980s, called Distinction. And in that, he was beginning to build a theory about the habitus and about the way that the social and economic environment shaped the very habits that people develop, their accents, their very ways of physically embodying themselves in the world. And it was a really important, I think, watershed in the way that the social sciences were connected to that broader biological and psychological science that we know about. Because he was bringing us this concept of capitals, the way that the resources in your environment, be they cultural resources, social resources, or economic resources, that the way that they influenced the way that the individual was being socialized and the kind of physiological development they were expressing, but also their kind of experience of nurturing some belonging and their social location. And of course, that then influenced certain outcomes for them, like their cognitive development, their physical development, and their psychological development. I think Bourdieu's theory here is really useful. Now, I'm going to need to speed on, okay, because we're nearly at the end now of the theoretical component, and I want to then move on to some of the work that I've done to try to describe and illustrate those processes I'm talking about. Just before I do that, I want to then bring all this together using what's known as the Strachan-Shake model of development, all right? So this is something from David Strachan. You may have come across David Strachan before. He was the man who put forward the hygiene hypothesis about the way that the physical environment leads to the way that the immune system can become more or less reactive and then lead to atopic diseases. So he worked on respiratory illness, but that same model about the development of what he would call health functioning, okay, can be broadened out to this general model of embodiment that I'm talking about. So what does this picture in front of you actually intend to show? What it shows you is that from early life, we're developing physical, psychological, and social capacity, okay? And that capacity is the y-axis here. It's the sort of like the vertical axis about over time, some people are developing more or less health capital, if we can broadly call it that, right? Some people are developing less. You can see you've got a shallower line there. So by the time we get to our mid-20s, some people have better capitals. That can be health capital, health functioning than others. The terminal quantity of health capital that they've developed, so think of health broadly here, health and well-being. This is about both physical health, but also about psychological health, about the terminal position that you get to there then might influence your subsequent decline in well-being across the life course. So you can see some people here are going to be on a shallower path of descent compared to others. And those, of course, health behaviors in adulthood can influence the extent of loss of function as people age. And that could be influenced by things like their psychological states, which will shape their health behaviors. So that if you've got worse health behaviors, more drinking, more tobacco consumption, less exercise across the life course, then that's going to lead to a quicker descent, but that too could be shaped by earlier exposures. It's a really nice model for trying to help us understand the way that our two questions from the beginning here are interlinked. Okay, so bear in mind here the processes of capital accumulation, the plasticity of the individual to the environment, which of course might change over time. We might be much more plastic early in life, even in infancy particularly, but in adolescence as well, and less plastic in other time points. And that plasticity has a role in shaping us. But it's also that canalization that happens over time. So we become less plastic to our environment as we age, okay? Right. Having mapped all that out for you, and with 10 minutes to go, can I now then give you some illustrations of this? And I'm going to give you illustrations of evidence from prospective cohort studies. I'm particularly going to focus on growing up in Ireland here. This is our longitudinal study of children from Ireland. And I'm going to be looking at BMI or obesity trajectories, okay, by social and economic background, with a little mention of cardiovascular health. I then want to draw upon some of the sort of quasi-experimental studies we've been doing in Ireland using the Great Recession that happened in Ireland, less so in Australia. But in Ireland, there was a really big impact of the Great Recession, and that we used that as a kind of natural experiment to try to look at how social and economic environment shapes health and educational outcomes. Lastly, I'm going to use some life course trajectory modeling using our older person's cohort study, which is called TILDA, the longitudinal study of aging in Ireland, okay? All right, so here's that slide you saw earlier on about the proportion having low birth weight by, this is the income position of the children at, this is when measured, we met this cohort, this is cohort 08, first 9 months, but we had records of their birth weight from the national perinatal system that allowed us to look at what proportions were low birth weight. And you can see here clear social differentiations early in life, can't you, in terms of their physical well-being. These low birth weight children are going to be much more likely to experience, they're going to be shorter than their peers as they age, and they're also going to be experiencing, it says, later influences of low birth weight on things like cognitive development, okay? This is just to illustrate that these differentials start very early. And although these children are shorter at birth, okay, than the children who come from more disadvantaged households are shorter at birth than their more advantaged peers, they're actually gaining weight quicker because of the social environments and economic environments that they're born into. There are differences in maternal behaviors that influence this, things like breastfeeding and weaning behaviors. But there's also the kind of social environment too, the differences that there are across children coming from different backgrounds in terms of the parenting that they receive, the very sort of psychological environments of those children. And all these things are contributing to growth in a birth in terms of their weight, okay, which is expressed here as body mass index. And what this chart is showing you is that, and here we're looking at millennium cohort study data. This is actually British data. You can see that as the child ages from age 3 through to 14, you get a clear differentiation between those coming with their mothers have primary education alone, secondary education, compared to third level education. And they're increasingly differentiated from their more advantaged peers in terms of their BMI, their body mass index, and their risk of obesity. This is for boys, but it's also true for girls. And what this is showing you is that there's a process of accumulation here from birth as the child is not only shorter, but is accumulating weight, body weight quicker, which leads to these differentiations in obesity risk. And obesity is a long-term predictor of dysregulation in metabolic systems that can lead to worse health outcomes later. Now, it's not just in Britain. This is our GUI data on the bottom two slides here. GUI is the Growing Up in Ireland study. But also there's data here you can see from G21, which is a Portuguese cohort. And we see exactly the same processes of accumulated risk and worse outcomes for those children. So you're seeing here a life course process where exposure early on in life is leading to worse outcomes over time across different cohorts in very similar ways. Although you can see here for Growing Up in Ireland, it's of a greater extent than it is for the other two cohorts. All right. So I want to put this forward as a nice example of the way that initial disadvantage, social disadvantage for young people leads to clustering of risks that the young person experiences. And that then leads to the accumulating differences across time, okay, as the child embodies their social and economic environment. The fact that the gradient widens over time has implications for that postnatal environment. Of course, the way that the child is experiencing their environment in terms of those factors I spoke about earlier on, in terms of breastfeeding and weaning, but also the availability of physical activity, but also that psychological environment that they're experiencing. Now, it's difficult to disentangle here whether this is a sort of a critical period effect that's happening in infancy. Right? So, for example, prenatal smoking has a measurable effect, or maternal prenatal smoking has a measurable effect on the child's subsequent obesity risk. But it's hard to see whether it is to disentangle really, whether it's that early exposure or the sort of correlation of that exposure with later accumulation, or both those things when we look at the child's subsequent trajectory. All right, so that's an accumulating risk factor that I want to show you there, that is then associated also with later variation in heart rate and blood pressure at age 17 or 18. But we can also look at this using observational data, but nonetheless observational data using a sort of quasi-experimental approach. And to do this, we can use the Great Recession in Ireland, because as this slide shows you, for both our cohorts, they were exposed to the Great Recession. These curves represent the unemployment rate in Ireland. And you can see the unemployment rate basically trebled between 2008 and 2011-12 before then receding afterward. And luckily, I say luckily, but of course it was a tragedy for a lot of families in Ireland. We had data collection waves for Growing Up in Ireland prior to the recession, about 2008-9, and then during the recession at the sort of depths of the recession, and then later after the recession in 2014-15. So we could follow young people over time, and we can use the Great Recession as a way of disentangling some of these earlier factors in the lives of young people and the sort of within variation that occurs when you get these later exposures. And we were trying to understand how the later exposures may then lead to differentials in terms of the trajectories that they then experience. So the way that exposure to the Great Recession as a natural experiment, as a kind of like exogenous variation, then pushed them onto a different trajectory. And we used particularly this model here. This is called the family stress model, which tries to understand how economic strain, economic pressure as a function of recession then influences child mental health, not only child mental health, but also the educational outcomes and their physiological outcomes via the effect that recession has on maternal and paternal mental health, because we saw higher rates of parent depression, higher rates of parent anxiety and psychological distress as a function of economic strain, which then impacts on their parenting themselves. They tend to be less warm, more hostile, less consistent parents. There's impacts then on the child's mental health that has impacts both on their physical health, their educational development, and their psychological health. And you can see that here in this slide, where you see for parents, as we saw more economic strain in the household between 9 and 13, we saw a greater instance of parental depression for both mothers and fathers. And that is a clear influence on the kinds of parenting that they then express. So here, for example, this is parent-child conflict. And as conflict got worse over time, the amount of conflict between parents and children got worse for both boys and girls, although there were differential levels for boys and girls. And that then also had an impact on the health of the children. So not only a psychological impact on the children, but here you can see on the risk that the child were experiencing of their physical health worsening. And here we're looking at atopic symptoms. This is particularly eczema and chronic asthma. Children were much more likely to experience both eczema and asthma over time as a function of the recession and its impact on the psychological environment in the household, and then that kick-on effect to their physical health. Clear interaction. We see this same process across the life course. Again, the interaction of different domains in the person's life. And we can look at it going backwards from old age. These are people aged 50 plus in our longitudinal study of older people called Tilda. It's looking backward, but how the life course influences people over time. Or were they going up or were they going down? And we can use kind of counterfactual trajectories for people. Oh, what's going on here? So we can think of the life course as a set of pathways that people follow. And if we want to look at how the life course experiences at different points in the life course influence outcomes, we can look at counterfactual trajectories. So, for example, some people would have stayed very advantaged from childhood into adulthood. Okay, so SEP here is social and economic position. And some people stayed in a high social and economic position from childhood through to adulthood. Some people were in a low social and economic position from childhood to adulthood. Others, though, would have gone upward. Their parents may have been in a poor social position in terms of education, income, social class, but they subsequently managed to attain a higher social position in adulthood. But the question is, was there some scarring effect from their childhood in terms of their adult life, their physiology in adult life? And also, in addition, was there some buffering of those that started off in a high social position in adulthood and subsequently went on to a low social position? And we can look at this using different outcomes, okay? The first one I'm going to show you here is in terms of gait speed. This is their walking speed that we measured in our longitudinal study of aging. And you can see here, there are clear differentiations in terms of people's life course trajectories. Those people who were stable high, that's the stable professional managerial or stable or manual, they had the fastest gait speeds, the fastest speeds of walking. Those who were stable low, those are the unskilled or semi-skilled, they had lower gait speeds. But notice here that the people who are on an upward trajectory, they have gait speeds which are actually closer to the most advantage, the stable advantage, which suggests here that there is a sort of like an accumulating risks factor, okay? So those who went upward gained the benefits of their subsequent rise in social mobility. Similarly, look at the downwardly mobile up the top there. The downwardly mobile have worse health in terms of their gait speeds. So we have indicators here that of an accumulation of risk across the life course that leads to worse health. It's not a critical period effect necessarily. It can be an accumulation of risk across the life course. Okay, let's move on lastly to another measure of accumulation across the life course. And this is what's known as epigenetic aging. Okay, so until we had blood samples that we could measure biological aging in terms of the extent of epigenetic change that people were experiencing. This is where the biological switches on the genome were being switched off by the body to try to achieve some kind of modification given the environment people are in. And the more modification there is, the more epigenetic change there is, that's a good indicator that the person has experienced adversity and has worse biological functioning. Notice here that the stable, unskilled have more epigenetic change. They're the group on the far right compared to those who are the stable professionals. But notice, the upwardly mobile have an amount of epigenetic change which is closer to the stable unskilled than it is to the stable professionals and stable high. This would suggest, again, that there's, though, some kind of critical period effect here, which is influencing those who are downwardly mobile, buffering them, and it's leading to a scarring for those who are upwardly mobile that we're trying to sort out ourselves now in terms of our analyses. Okay, so let me just try to quickly conclude, because I need to finish. Differentials in health by social network position emerge early in life and increase with age, suggesting a very accumulating process. And this is particularly true in terms of the metabolic function of the person that we've seen in terms of the process called inflammation. But essentially what you're seeing there is the embodiment of risk from the environment into the individual physiologically, which are then influenced as well by the psychosocial mechanisms that I showed you from our experimental or pseudo-experimental studies that we've done. Clearly, the institutional mechanisms and psychosocial risks then also shape those trajectories. And it was good to see that actually subsequent mobility can help to compensate for earlier disadvantage. So it's not fate, in a sense, in those early exposures. All right. Given my overall view here, my overall presentation here, I hope you'd agree that we clearly have to see physiological change and inequalities being linked to those social risks that people are experiencing earlier on, and also to their acquisition of human capital and of those social and emotional skills that help them, the so-called non-cognitive traits that help those people to do well in education and in the occupational sphere. But clearly these factors are all very intimately related, and we have to see them as being part and parcel of that overall process of embodiment and change across time. Okay. Sorry about the slightly breathless presentation there, but thank you very much for your time and listening to this. And many thanks to my co-authors on all these different papers from across Europe, and particularly my colleagues, Causal McCrory and Erica Reinhardt and Lydia Panico, who I would have worked with very closely. Thank you very much indeed.
So we have some comments in the chat box. I don't know if Kevin, if you wanted to, you had a few things. I don't know if you wanted to ask your questions or.
I mean, I'm interested in the immune system work that you touched on at the end, because I've been reading more and more about biological embedding pathways through the immune system. So, but you've touched on it.
I have to admit here, okay, that I am not an immunologist. I'm a sociologist. So I have to work with colleagues who are much more insightful about these things than I am, okay? But I must say that those interdisciplinary teams work really well. So people like Paolo Vinese, that I worked with, he's a fantastic biologist in Imperial, and Carl himself is a really good neuroscientist. And what the studies are showing, using, as you said, using our social indicators, okay, and the social processes that we know shape the experience within households, is that there are real physiological changes going on that we can directly measure in the bloods that we've got from both young people and from adults later in life. There are real physiological changes which are occurring, which are, this gives us this really exciting prospect of being able to identify the very mechanisms which are being influenced here, and then trying to think about where do we intervene here? I mean, because there are some quite complicated, factors that we need to think about. There's no, it might be that there's some silver bullets, maybe we can have some kind of biological intervention here, but actually, given the processes that I've been talking about, which are very much ones which can be psychological and get embedded in the sort of physiology of the individual, there's sort of a lot of questions to be asked here, I think, about what's efficacious, how should we think about intervention here, and what role can social and economic policy play in attempting to prevent some of these exposures.
In the LSAC data here, we have data on grandparents' health of the focal child, and we've got a PhD student here at UQ, Yong Bo, who is looking at the health outcomes of LSAC children in relation to the health of grandparents, and showing some really strong and interesting effects. He's looking at BMI and diet and other, just general well-being. And I know that the group from LCC at Tells Kids have done the same thing, looking at educational outcomes, again, showing some really interesting 3-generational effects. So just a comment, and I wondered if there's anything like that in growing up in Ireland, to look at those kind of longer term, because we often focus on parents, but, the effects, I think, start, well before parenthood.
Yeah, those are fascinating questions, aren't they? Really goes back to Waddington's work as well. Conrad Waddington was thinking about these kind of multi-generational processes back in the 1950s, really when he had no tools to be able to investigate it. And it is a really fascinating question. I have to say, first of all, we don't have that data. Okay, so we do have information on grandparents where they care for the child for more than eight hours a week, but our measures are all focused on the child. Their grandparent report of the child. We don't have anything on the grandparents themselves. Having said that, okay, there is a cohort that was gathered from University College Dublin, and that is called Lifeways, and that has shown some intergenerational effects with grandparents. But the difficulty is that cohort was really badly underpowered, and it suffered subsequent attrition, which meant that it's very hard to draw conclusions from it. Nonetheless, it did show some indications of multi-generational effects here from the grandparents' exposures through to the children. I'm really interested to hear your colleagues have been looking at this. It's an area which is only really beginning to emerge now. So, for example, I don't know if you know the Dutch famine studies that were done, where in the Netherlands in September 1944. When the Dutch resistance tried to aid the Allies when they were invading the Netherlands, attempting to take the bridges across the Rhine, essentially, the Germans responded by cutting off all food supplies into the Netherlands. And that led to a famine that lasted between September 44 through to about March 45. And what you had there was a very well-fed, advanced country that was suddenly plunged into famine, and, calorific consumption dived by about 2/3, and the consumption of proteins completely dived. And this, you had women who were in different stages of gestation during that period, and the Dutch have subsequently followed those children, and they see these multi-generational effects from the Dutch famine, very much in terms of, the kinds of things that Richard Barker was talking about in terms of those kind of metabolic programming. They see that metabolic programming in the Netherlands, and it might be one of the factors that leads to the Dutch being some of the tallest in the world. There was a kind of response that you had these calorifically constricted individuals in gestation that were then subsequently exposed to a first world, really high quality welfare state with lots of antibiotics, and healthcare, and subsequently grew really, really strongly, and that went on to the grandchildren as well. So really interesting effects. One thing I just wanted to mention here, while saying this, is I've always been fascinated in the role that the Great Famine had in Ireland. So in the mid-19th century, you probably know that Ireland experienced the potato famine. And I always wonder what effects that had on subsequent generations of Irish people. And then that's an area where it would be really interesting to try to bring together some of the evidence there might be about that.
I think we'll end there then. And I want to thank Richard again for his great presentation. Richard, I think you're happy to take questions if people want to email you or if they have other questions later on. Yeah. And I think we have his email on the flyer as well. Just looking ahead, we have 2 other speakers for the rest of December, or for the rest of the year, 1 in 2 weeks, and then 1 final seminar in December. So I just want to say thank you to everyone again, and to Richard as well, and feel free to, send him any comments or questions along the way.
Yeah, thank you very much for all your questions and for the invitation to come and speak today. I was delighted to touch base with you and to get a chance to learn something of your work, which is very relevant to my own. So I'll be reading some papers and maybe be in touch with some of you, perhaps, about some of the things that you're working on, because it would be great to think about possible collaborations for the future.